Welcome to the Professional Editors Podcast, episode 102. I'm joined today by, as always, by my co-host, Karen Conlon. Karen, how's it going?
It's going pretty good today.
That is excellent. We have actually been talking for almost an hour straight about the very issue that we're going to talk about in 20 minutes. There's no way to fit any of this in. But we had some questions on the comma, and it seems like such an innocuous thing,
Yes.
of course. But
it's the bane of my existence. It's not innocuous. It's a horrific little thing.
Well, there you go. I think that this was one of those areas where even though we both sort of come to this middle on things, we have very different approaches. And it started off with me saying, oh, there's no rules. I mean, I think you'll hear me say that a lot. And you came at me with, what was the name of the book again?
I have it right here. Hold on. The Little English Handbook, Choices and Conventions by Conventions. I'm the one who can't talk now. By Edward P.J. Corbett. And this was required for me during my first college experience back in between 1975 and 1979. The copyright on this version is 1973 and 1977. So I must have bought it in 77. So it's not new, and I don't have anything updated on it. I don't even know if it's still available, but I have always kept it because it's handy. It's a little pocket-sized book.
Well, I just think it was interesting because when we first started talking, you did use the word rules. You used the word rules for commas, and if I kind of push you on the spot and ask you honestly, do you really feel that there are some pretty darn close to rules when it comes to things like the comma?
I think there are pretty darn close to generally accepted guidelines that people want to be rules. We as people, I think, in my experience anyway, we want there to be rules. We want there to be something we can look at and go, oh, it says I have to do that, so that's what I'm going to do. And the more I work as an editor, even after all these years, these many decades, I am still finding that no, there aren't really rules with a capital R. There are guidelines. Chicago has its set, AP has its set, MLA has its own set, Oxford has its own set, and sometimes they coincide and sometimes they don't. And which is why a lot of times when I answer a question about punctuation, I'll say, here's what I do. I get that from this book on this page because that's what I'm used to working with. But is there a rule that you can never, ever, ever break? I'm not so sure.
And of course, I obviously don't think that at all. I think that rules are sort of contrivances that we use when we have standardized education and movable typeface, I think, and actually gets us into, I thought we should do sort of a quick rundown of the history of punctuation / the comma. I mean, it could go on for ages and ages. I'll try to boil this down very quickly.
Well, we've already gone on for an hour, so we have to contain ourselves.
Yes, we do. Thankfully not on the history. I'm not that boring, but I do enjoy my history.
I don't think
what's
it's
interesting
boring at
about the
all.
comma is that it comes from late Latin as we know it now, but it's actually a word that comes almost directly out of the Greek. Commas, the idea of a comma, are actually just as old as Greek, although many of the first languages evolved without any punctuation of any kind. And in fact, even in Greek, things like the New Testament papyri were written in all capital letters, no punctuation, no spacing. So commas and punctuation as we understand them is actually a very modern thing. But the word itself I found very fascinating, and I think it's a perfect metaphor for today because it means to cut off. And it comes from a verb which means to strike or to chop. And that is what a comma does. A comma chops, strikes, in some way impedes the flow of a sentence. And if we fast forward in time, when it came to movable typeface and being able to do printing, and where space wasn't necessarily as key as it was when you're making your paper by hand, for instance, then you had to come up with some rules, some guidelines, some here's what you do and here's what you don't do. But they all arose out of this idea of chopping or cutting the flow, and what we now call the pause. So I have a funny poem, if you'll allow me to read it, that is from the 19th century by Cecil Hartley, and it explains how you should use the different punctuation points. And if you'll notice, it has everything to do with how you read them. So here we go, and please pardon me if I accidentally slip into an Old English accent without realizing it. To stop, point out, with truth, the time of pause a sentence doth require at every clause. At every comma, stop while you count one. At semicolon, 2 is the amount. A colon doth require the time of 3. The period 4, as learned men agree. I find that kind of funny because, of course, I didn't even follow the rules, which would have had me counting a very, very long time on a period. I think a count of 4.
A count of 4, yes.
But
I don't know anybody who waits that long.
There's one of the very first instances. I'm sorry, not one of the first instances, but there's one of the sort of humorous attempts to teach what a comma and a punctuation mark is. And in this case, it varies closely tied to spoken language. What do you think about that? Do you think that commas have moved past that a little bit, or are they still that which creates a pause?
Oh, I think it definitely creates a pause. The question comes in, do you need that pause? Do you want the pause there? Do you want the reader to continue reading without stopping? Is the pause important to the meaning of the sentence, is what I end up coming down to. Do you need the pause to make your meaning clear? If you do, you probably want to put a comma there. If you don't need the pause to make the meaning clear, then maybe you don't want to put a comma there. And at the same time, I have to balance that with whatever the guideline says for what I'm being told to follow by whoever's paying my bills.
And there we go. I think, of course, we're obviously being independent editors, and our page is sort of dedicated to independent editors. We're probably dealing with a lot of people that are their own masters in a way. Even if they hire us, they're still their own masters. We work for them. And if they tell us that they don't want to have any Oxford commas, of course, we will help them locate and destroy.
But much as it makes me twitch, I will do it.
And we're gonna talk about your twitching in a second. But
good.
You brought up a really interesting point, which was, do you need the pause to make your meaning clear? And Oscar Wilde, probably a famous quote I'm sure everyone has heard: "All morning I worked on the proof of one of my poems, and I took out a comma. In the afternoon, I put it back."
And I will point out that that's punctuated with commas and a semicolon.
Yes, and hopefully I did pause enough on the semicolon for...
I don't know if you counted to 2. I wasn't paying attention.
Well, I didn't count to 2, but I did try and give it a larger pause. And of course, we could do a whole episode on the loss of the semicolon and its implications.
Yeah.
But the idea here, of course, is that one of the later rules that we'll talk about, the comma after poems may or may not be necessary, and some would argue that it's not. But the meaning was for Wilde to cause me, the reader, to pause when I spoke it aloud. And of course, Wilde, I think, probably had a unique relationship with the spoken language, as he did write both in the prose form but also in play. And of course, the idea of conveying your meaning through the spoken image, the spoken language, is almost more important than readers who often skip little things like commas and semicolons, as we have noted. So yeah, I totally agree with you. The idea, I think, that we need to stress, even as we start to get into some of the curmudgeonary areas of this topic, is that clarity and, in some ways, aesthetic and artistic inspiration, does that comma, does that chop, that pause, suit what you're trying to convey, or could you say it another way?
Yeah, which goes to your point you were making just before we started recording about if you're having to look up the rule for whether you need a comma there or not, you might need to just consider rewriting the sentence.
I use that for myself, and then I also use it for people that I work with. Now, I do have to mea culpa a little bit, that I usually work with young adult, new adult, and literary authors. So in those cases, I have sort of two masters going on. There's definitely an idea of what the audience would support and not support. But with the literary fiction, I have to give preference to the artistic creation of the language rather than the rules. However, in the same thing, even with the literary, if I do find myself going, okay, wait, what's the rule? Then I'll probably turn to the author and say, this is just muddy. This is unclear. let's see if we can't tweak it, rework it. Because I honestly feel like we create rules rather than rewriting. I think that we throw out rules rather than simply having the bravery to say, hey, that doesn't make any sense. Can you say it a different way?
And I will also bring this up. This just occurred to me. I got a quick proofing job yesterday, kind of came over the transom to me, and it was very much appreciated, for an ebook, which I'd actually already gotten and read, so I knew what kind of things I was going to be looking for. And the writer adores commas. But because of the way the book is written, it's in a first person point of view, and the voice is so interesting, at least to me, I left a lot of things that, had it been for a different purpose, I would have been pretty much impelled to either fix or rewrite because of the proliferation of commas in the text.
Was it a stream of consciousness sort of first person?
So, I guess you could say that.
Because I have to point out, because that's actually what I write. So I do have to point out to all of our listeners that if you are writing first person stream of consciousness, you have to be prepared to break the rules and take flack for it, because honestly, the artistic expression, the artistic form of the first person stream of consciousness can't be bogged down by grammar rules and typography.
No, and that's why I let so much of it go, because it made so much sense in the context of the presentation. There wasn't any reason for me to change it. It would have been detrimental to the flow of it and the meaning of it and the sound of it and the feel of it and everything else. It would have destroyed it.
Well, we have to circle around though, because there are times, and I have another example here. This is from 1885, and where punctuation is incredibly important. And yes, it could be rewritten, but sometimes for humor and just sometimes for artistic effect, the punctuation will make it all the better. So here is the unpunctuated form of the sentence. Charles I walked and talked half an hour after his head was cut off. Obviously, that's a very unclear sentence. But if we go forward and we change the punctuation and actually add it in, it becomes Charles I walked and talked half an hour after his head was cut off.
Okay, I actually like the first sentence better because it makes me laugh a whole lot more.
That's true. There's a lot of humor in the first one.
Charles I walked and talked half an hour after his head was cut off. It kind of like the chicken running around, after it's been beheaded. And I guess my question would almost be, if I didn't know the history, which one's correct? Although we know the first one is obviously humorous.
Well, this is coming for clarity. This is coming from the American printer, and was used as an example to show how important punctuation was.
Why we need it. We need it to say that, yes, Charles I walked and talked. Half an hour after he walked and talked, his head was cut off.
And of course, many among us will simply say, oh, well, you should just rewrite that. But I think this is one of those cases where I love the artistry. Like you said, it's very funny. I love the artistry of what's being created.
Yes.
And to simply compound it with an aesthetic for brevity and for clarity, we lose the fun and the joyousness.
The fun's all gone. The fun is totally gone.
So, however...
it should be fun.
Yeah, it should. Well, writing, I hope everyone who's listening to us, writing is fun for you. If you dread talking to us because we're going to make it unfun, I swear we won't. We're going to try and help you to preserve the fun and your meaning at the same time.
And if it's never fun, you should maybe think about doing something else. I'm just saying.
That's true. That's very true. I mean, there's one reason why I do more developmental editing than copy editing, and it does have to do with the fun. I really enjoy the story. I don't enjoy so much digging down into the little nitty-gritties, although, of course, I really enjoy digging down into why the nitty-gritties aren't nitty-gritties. That's probably my joyous bit.
And that's fun. Then there's the fun.
Well, let's go ahead and talk a little bit about the various ideas of rules or rules in which basic comma issues fall. I will say for the listeners, we are not going to cover stylistic commas. These will be the commas in dates, the commas that are used merely as a typography contrivance in order to either set things apart visually or to make them clear while in printed format. We're going to talk more about issues that the comma relies upon for meaning and for clarity of the actual content. So there are 15 pages in my Chicago Manual Style dedicated to the comma and its proper usage. We're probably going to go over about a page of those that are, I think, more important to the creation of the language, not so much into the presentation of it.
Right.
Okay. So
Right.
there's the big one. And I don't know why it's so big, but there's the big one. That's the Oxford comma, the serial comma. So in this case, it's the question of, is it apples, comma, pears, comma, and bananas? Or is it apple, comma, pears, and bananas? Where do you fall on this? And you said that you twitched. You got to tell us why you twitch and why you like the Oxford or not.
I was born and raised with the serial comma. It was drilled into me throughout my elementary education that you put a comma before the and. Why? I don't know. That's what we were told. So it's what we did. And it's what I grew up with, and it's what I'm used to. However, I am perfectly willing to, and the word is escaping me.
Sounds like you're willing to acquiesce, maybe.
That's the one. That's the one. There it is. I'm willing to acquiesce that it may not be necessary for the meaning. If I see apples, pears, and bananas, apples, comma, pears, and bananas, I know there are three things. There are apples, there are pears, and there are bananas. Just like if I see apples, comma, pears, comma, and bananas, I still know there are three things: apples, pears, and bananas.
When we come to the subject of this serial comma and meaning making, we have a much better example of why there is a place for it. But the general rule that I sort of used when I was teaching students actually had to do with the similar versus dissimilar. Similar things you can group together, probably not use the comma, and it's clear that it's a list. These are all three types of foods. I don't think anyone is going to object to whether or not you're shoving a pear and a banana at the same time into your mouth, or whether you have eaten them on separate occasions. The similarity is going to sort of give you the serialness to it. There are two very specific instances where it is almost necessary to use the Oxford comma from a clarity perspective. One is when it is a series of clauses, snippets, fragments, whatever you want to call them. But if it is a series of things that are more than one word in length, that comma is almost essential. And the second is when you have compounds within the list that do go together. And so you came up with a great example, and I'm sort of paraphrasing it, but we have the Bishops of Canterbury, comma, London, comma, and Bath and Wales. I've set it up in this way because obviously now we know that Bath and Wales is one parish according to this.
I will point out that it's Bath and Wells.
Oh, like sorry.
Wells, what water comes from. That's okay.
As I said, I was paraphrasing.
Yeah, that's all right. And the only reason I know that is I had cause to peruse my Oxford Manual of Style, and that was one of the things that they used as an example.
Gotcha. Well,
that's the only reason I know about Bath and Wells.
In this case, the serial comma is necessary because there's a dissimilarity and there's a compound involved. So had Wells, Bath and Wells, been second in the list, that serial comma would become almost completely necessary so that we know that that and is a conjunction between those two objects, not simply the English throw-in to get the serial finished off. It has a different function.
If it were to be the Bishops of Canterbury, Bath and Wells, and London, you would have to say the Bishops of Canterbury, comma, Bath and Wells, comma, and London. Because otherwise, someone who didn't know that Bath and Wells is a unit could wrongly assume that it's London and Bath and Wells as the unit, and that's incorrect.
We don't want to make rules necessarily, but we are going to tell you that when you have things of dissimilar lists or you have compound things in your list, that comma is almost a courtesy and sometimes completely necessary, as we've just pointed out.
Right.
Let's move forward though, because there are so many to talk about. But
there are.
my next favorite one, and it's simply because actually I came across several bloggers who had competing and contrasting examples of correctness on this, but it is the comma splice. So your commas are the bane of your existence. I think it's your full right to tell us what is a comma splice.
My working definition which may or may not be the same as the actual definition, which I think has probably changed a few times between when somebody first came up with that term and now, is that a comma splice causes what we call a run-on sentence and should probably be replaced by either a semicolon or a period, unless you're not the kind of person who twitches over that kind of thing.
And there's our problem right there. And I think the reason that maybe we're having more run-on sentences than usual these days is because we have lost a semicolon. But that's not today's discussion. Today's discussion is commas.
That's a whole separate problem. But it ties into this.
It does tie into this. And yes, the comma splice in sort of its modern curmudgeon usage is simply to say that you have an independent clause which should not be an independent clause, but in fact should be an independent sentence. Sure, there is nothing wrong with saying you have too many commas, you could probably make multiple sentences. Anytime you have independent clauses in a sentence, the same rule could be implied. So rather than hunting down every single sentence which includes more than one independent clause and eliminating and shooting commas on sight, we will say that there are times where it can be attached in such a way as to be unclear, in which case definitely cut that splice out, put a period in. And then other times the meaning really is very clear. And so here's an actual quote that was printed in the BBC News. And I do need to point out that it is a quote. So this is not BBC News style, but they are actually quoting an individual.
Right.
There are no niceties in Klingon. I think that's why a lot of people like it. It's very straightforward.
And those pauses are commas, not periods.
Exactly. But you can hear...
The people who are listening can't tell that it's a comma and not a period. So I want to make sure that they understand. There are no niceties in Klingon, comma. I think that's why a lot of people like it, comma. It's very straightforward, period. Or full stop, or full point, as was another issue this past week.
Yes. Well, and this is a classic example of the fact that the pause is created by the speaker, and it's now up to you and I listening to try and determine whether that was a comma pause, was that a 2-count pause, was that a 3-count pause,
or was it a 4-count pause? Yes. What was that?
Standing by with our various instruments of grammatical torture.
Yes.
And infractions. But the idea here is that the speaker themselves, according to the BBC, probably ran this all together in what we consider a run-on sentence. But the idea of unclarity, of not understanding, doesn't exist. So there's really no reason to sort of hunt down these commas and eliminate them. And if this is an accurate representation of how the person was speaking, that's fine. And if this was in a book, like you said, a first-person narrative, we speak in run-on sentences in our head all the time. I speak in run-on sentences on the air. But the idea is that...
I think we both do.
It's a natural progression.
We're speaking.
Yes. It's a natural progression when you're representing natural language like that. Now, were this to be printed in the actual BBC News, would they have eliminated these? Probably. Does it change the meaning? Not really, but a little, but not really.
I don't think it changes the meaning at all. It changes how you might read it or how you would hear it, but the meaning is clear regardless of whether those are commas or periods. There are no niceties in Klingon.
I will say psychologically, commas versus periods change things from sort of wavering to definite. There is sort of a underpinning definiteness. There are no niceties in Klingon, period. I think that's why a lot of people like it. Period. I mean, you can kind of, I'm banging my fist on the desk here. You can kind of feel this banging in your fist. There is a psychological impact of short, decisive sentences that is slightly different than using a comma. And there's a good note. If you are writing ad copy, for instance, or things in which you wish to convey different psychological approaches, your punctuation is almost as important as the words you choose, because again, it's how it's being divided up by the brain. Whether or not we realize it, we are interpreting those slightly different than we are the other punctuation marks. So there's a whole nother side issue to talk about.
I would agree with that. Yeah.
Here's an older example, and one that, again, going towards poetry, I think is beautiful. He saw no individuals, comma. He was conscious of a froth of pink faces, comma, of waving arms and garments, comma. He felt the occult influence of a vast crowd pouring over him, comma, buoying him up. And that's from H.G. Wells. What if we broke that into separate sentences, Karen? Would we lose any meaning?
Would we lose meaning? Not necessarily. Would we lose the feeling that Wells intended to impart to the reader? Absolutely. because, as you just said, you'd have all these short, definitive sentences. He saw no individuals, period. He was conscious of a froth of pink faces, of waving arms and garments, period, is how I would do it if I were to change it, which I wouldn't. He felt the occult influence of a vast crowd pouring over him, comma, buoying him up, period. It's the flow is gone. I think here the whole point is that froth, the waving,
Exactly.
the pouring.
This is a psychological effect. You are literally feeling what the words are describing. That is a facet of literary fiction that is beautiful when done correctly, because you can change the ebb and the flow, the way the words wash over you or don't wash over you, simply by having a run-on sentence at a very opportune moment.
And I think I'm going to interject this because this just occurred to me. It didn't come up in our hour-long conversation. I think that part of my experience in this comes from the fact that I cut my teeth on editing technical manuals. You don't get to be artistic in a technical manual. And I include role-playing game books in that because they're books of rules and guidelines for how you are to play this game.
Of course, I love that example. I love that metaphor because also logically they are rules that are consistently broken as well. And in fact, there's a rule about how to break the rules.
Absolutely. But in the presentation of the textual rules, how to roll up your character. First, get a character sheet. Second, get your dice. Third, roll your dice like this. It's very definitive. Do this, then do this, then do this. And in the explicatory information, you can be as artistic as you like. But when you're telling somebody, here are the steps, you tell them the steps.
Indeed, indeed.
And I think that's part of what colors how I approach my editing work now. And in having edited some stuff that isn't technical manuals, I apply a different set of guidelines to that. I don't get as, I'm going to say it. I'm not going to get as hard ass because I don't. I would, when I was working on the proofreading job in the first person stream of consciousness, I turned that part off because that's not applicable here.
And this
I'm waving my hands.
This is
nobody can see me.
Nobody can see you. Yeah, that's the lovely of radio. But we have a couple other little things to get through before we go too long on this one. The identifier name. 2 examples. I went to see Woody Allen's latest movie, comma, Midnight in Paris, comma, with my oldest friend, comma, Jesse. Or I went to see the movie Midnight in Paris with my friend Jesse. Now, we actually, I think, went about 20 minutes on this together.
Yeah, I think so.
What is the sort of general takeaway from this? Why is the comma specifically around Midnight in Paris useful to the meaning of this sentence?
Because it's further explaining what Woody Allen's latest movie is. If the person's a real Woody Allen fanatic, they probably already know that it's Midnight in Paris, but the person to whom they're speaking or the person who's reading this might not know.
And there's a temporal thing as well. If this sentence is actually in print and being read 5 years from now, the latest movie
that time.
will be changed. So
right.
In some ways it's an aside of particular note that helps explain things, but because it's an aside, it's an addition almost to the main flow. In that case, the pauses, the commas are helpful to set it apart.
Right.
Most speakers, and I'm just going to go out here, most speakers do not use these commas in real life. These are courtesy commas, similar to the Oxford, but not as imperative to the meaning, I think.
I would agree with that.
Okay. Which, of course, leads us to the same thing as a parenthetical comma, I feel. Anytime that you have a clause that interrupts another sentence, courtesy and then, of course, for meaning, do set it aside. So here's an example. My father never took a vacation. That's a very simple idea. If we want to expand upon the father, and I think authors really enjoy this in literature, especially when they're introducing a new character, for instance, then the parenthetical comes into use. My father, who gave new meaning to the expression hardworking, never took a vacation.
Right.
There was an error, actually, and the reason that I pulled the sentence out is that the second comma, the comma after hardworking, was omitted in the original. And there, I think, is a case where if you have a parenthetical, you got to have an opening and a closing mark. Otherwise,
Right.
even though the meaning is completely clear to the listener, the grammatical meaning can drastically change. And so it's another idea of being clean and tidy in your typography as in your meaning, maybe.
Yeah, I would agree. It's like you tying it to the parenthetical. If you have an open parenthesis, you need a closing parenthesis to match it. You don't just use one and then just continue for days and then go, oh, I need a closing parenthesis, and you stick it wherever. It has a place. It has a proper place where it gives meaning to what has been written. And the same thing needs to happen with commas used like parentheses. If you have an opening one, you have to have a closing one.
And actually, there's a great sort of visual metaphor for this. I was working on a rough cut of a film that I wrote. I watched the rough cut, which is sort of everything out of the can, not really edited. And then I watched the second version, which was close to what was finally released. And the director had gone back in and put in insert shots, which are quick flashes of what a character is looking at or items in the room, just to add a little bit of depth to what's going on, so it's not just two people's faces talking the whole time.
Talking heads.
Exactly. Yeah. What was interesting though about this is that the scene was so intense and so well acted by the actors that when he put in the insert shots, the scene seemed to take longer. Even though it was physically the same exact amount of time as the original take, those insert shots, those commas, slowed it down. And I think as we come to the close, that is what the comma does to both the reader and to your thought, is that it slows the process down. Right. Do you want to do that? Do you not? This is our final example. This is an example of a correct usage that was fixing a comma splice. I hope to send to you before Monday an updated resume. That is given with no commas and a period at the end. Of course, I think you would agree, Karen, that's just a nasty sentence.
It's horrifying. I cannot wrap my head around the fact that somebody suggested that as correct. I just can't. And
again, this is from a business school who was fixing a comma splice in this case. I believe there was an extra comma after Monday. I have a assignment for all of you that we would love to see in the comments. If you go ahead and record, go outside, go to a park, go to a pub, go to McDonald's, it doesn't matter, and just record for your own usage about 30 seconds of some sort of conversation, and then take it home and transcribe it. But don't transcribe it according to rules. Transcribe it according to counts of pauses, and see how the punctuation is actually being used in natural language. Not only will I think it surprise you, but it will also help you hopefully be a better dialogue writer as well. Karen, thank you for joining me. Do you have any final thoughts on the comma before we sign off?
It's still the bane of my existence, and I think it will be until the end of that physical existence, and perhaps follow me into my next life. People want rules, and there aren't any. That's the problem. Now I'm pounding on the table. There are accepted guidelines, and even within those accepted guidelines, there are differences. And it always comes back for me to, what style guide are you using? Pick one. There we go. I don't care which one it is. Just pick one. And when you send me your work, tell me which one you use so I can look and go, oh yeah, that's what that says. Or, that didn't say that, and I think what you mean is this. And I'll work with you. I really will.
Thanks for listening today. This has been the Professional Editors Podcast with Dave Arney and Karen Conlin. Don't forget to subscribe on whatever medium you're listening to. All our shows will be live on YouTube on Fridays. You can view us on the Professional Editors page on Google+, and we're also both available for questions and comments on Google+ as well.